Okay, sorry for that. We tried it on. I mean, we tried it before and it worked. So we don't know what happened. I'll speak in English, I think. I mean, every presentation so far has been in English, so not to be the outlier, I'll keep the same language. First of all, I'd like to thank Frederick and Alex for the invitation and the organization. It's the third time I've been here, so I'm very excited. Every year I've presented something slightly different. I always use the rain a bit to try new ideas, so it's always great. Then I go home and then turn that into something else. So today, well, we're waiting a bit, but Frederick invited me to present about this notion of workflows. And I come from a more theoretical framework background. I'm a philosopher, so I work more with words and concepts. And we've been doing for the last 2 years, 3 years now, a specific project on the use of AI in the film industry with Peise, another colleague that used to be at Amsterdam. But since that project ended, now we're shifting to a more conceptual project. There it is, finally. The slides will be in Spanish, my talk will be in English, and the subtitles will be in Catalan. So there's a bit for everyone. So I took the invitation of Frederick to introduce the section on workflows very literal. So I said, okay, what does the term workflow mean? Well, the joke doesn't work if it's in English, but it's a flow of work. So that we are still in the same place. We haven't really gone anywhere. So then we need to think, okay, what is work? As I said, I come from philosophy. So if we're going to talk about workflows, it's a flow of work or labor. What is labor then? So we can always go to Marx for a classic definition of what is work. And he would say it's the expenditure of human energy to transform nature in order to produce something useful. That's a very useful definition because it's very universal and it applies both from the production of, food to art. Okay, and this process, so it's always a process. It's not a thing, but a process, and it has 3 elements. He says the object you work on, so you could say the raw material. The means, so the tools, the machines, and the activity as such. Okay, we'll come back to this. So, what is the origin of this term? It can be traced back to Taylor's notion of scientific management. So he was the first one to think of labor process as a flow of different stages in a process. And his aim was to manage that in the most efficient way. This was later complemented with Gann's famous Gantt chart, which was a visual representation of Taylor's scientific management. And the term as such, workflow, was first used in 1921. This is thanks to Wikipedia. By the railway engineer. It's an engineering publication which I really tried to access, but I couldn't, unfortunately, to get the original source. So what we can see, it's in its origin, the notion of workflow is tied to industrial capitalism, okay, and to Fordism and Taylorism. Okay, of course, Chaplin's representation of that in modern times is the most sort of exemplary, representation of this type of fragmentation and standardization of labor. So for a very long time, the idea of workflow was sort of antagonistic to the creative practices. Okay, so if you think of someone like Pollock, he would be very sort of reactionary against the idea that his creative process could be translated in Taylor's sort of idea of workflow. Okay, and that's where we sort of stand as a starting point, but as we know, things are usually more complicated. So what I want to do today is two things. First, to provide more of a history of different modes of different workflows or different ages of workflows to sort of challenge this sort of more binary opposition. So that's the first part. I'll do it very quickly. And the second part, I want us to look at the human-machine interaction and offer a more granular vocabulary to do that, okay? Beyond the mere idea of automation that we still have in the idea of industrial capitalism. So let's start by dividing this into 3 stages or 3 ages of workflows, okay? We will call it artisanal workflow or pre-industrial workflow, industrial workflow, and post-industrial workflow. And towards the end, maybe, I don't know, we'll probably not have a lot of time, but I want us to think, can we now speak of a 4th age or stage of workflows in the context of generative AI? But I'm not going to go into that, but we can keep it open, and hopefully maybe the sessions this afternoon can help us to reflect about that. So, what's unique about an artisanal or pre-industrial workflow? Well, the main characteristic is its unitary character. So the entire workflow is unitary, it's a unit, okay? And it's what unifies it is the figure of the craftsman or the artisan. Okay? So if you think of an artisanal workshop, the entire workflow sort of revolves around this one artisan or craftsman that in themselves have both the knowledge and the skills. Okay? And that is gained through experience. And they also unify the relation between the work and the tool. They are flexible. Precisely because of this unit, they can sort of accommodate, but at the same time, there's a limitation of how fast they can work and how much they can. What is the scalability of their process? You know, if they want to produce faster, there's a limitation. They can try to hire someone else, but then that someone else will also need to have that same experience. So it's not that easy to replace. Okay? So that's what we would call the pre-industrial workflow. Then we have an industrial workflow, which is Taylorism or Fordism, which is characterized by a division of labor that leads to fragmentation, standardization, hyper-specialization. So each person in the assembly line does just one little thing, but also leads to de-skilling. And there's a separation between conceptualization and execution. And there's also a centralized control over the speed of the work. Like in Chaplin's, suddenly the boss decides to, speed up the assembly line, and then it goes beyond the limits of the human body. Okay? And there's a discipline, and there's a shift from the tool in the pre-industrial to the machine in the industrial component. So, of course, this has been studied extensively by a lot of different authors that have focused on Taylorism and Fordism. I'm not going to go into detail, but I want us to see the very big difference between the two. And then we have a post-industrial workflow, which comes, it's sort of has to be contextualized in this shift towards the knowledge economy. So what we have is a sort of what we would call managed flexibility. So there's standardization, but also creativity. So you're expected to follow certain rules, but you're also expected to produce new things all the time. Okay. And there's a shift in the temporal model. This is very interesting because one of the things that's characteristic of the post-industrial workflow is what is called just-in-time. So the labor process is activated once consumption has been secured. Okay, so the most classic example would be delivery apps or Uber. So the labor process is only activated once the supply, once the demand has been secured. It's not like industrial, you produce a lot of things and then you take them to the market and hope that you sell them. Here, the labor process is activated only once that the demand has been activated. There's a lot of outsourcing and then a new logic of discipline. So it's no longer the boss or the assembly line, but it's usually this idea of self-discipline and goal-oriented. Okay, not going to go into detail. So very quickly, what I find interesting is that if we look at the history of film production, we find even today all the three types of workflows. So if you think of, Svan Meyer doing his stop-motion animations, we still have a very artisanal way of, and Svan Meyer sort of course, there's still division of labor, but everything is surrounded by the idea of the craftsman. We have the studio system that's more like the Chaplin's assembly line, and Netflix would be more of this the post-industrial workflow where the production is already triggered by consumption. Okay, so. Following this, one of the questions I said is I'm interested is, can we speak now in the context of generative AI of a fourth type of workflow? But I'm not going to answer that. We can leave that for the discussion. So let's look now at the second part of the quote, which is about the relationship between work and the tools. And what I want to do here is to, again, think beyond the idea of AI as just automation. Okay, so I want to offer sort of a more granular vocabulary. I'll try to do this quickly. So I want to think of at least four. This is as far as I've made it. 4 different concepts to think about this relationship between humans and machines. Let's remember that we're using the definition of work that requires work is always, there's never work without tools, even if those tools are the most basic means of production. Okay? So this relationship can be of 4 types so far. I mean, there's probably many more. So automation, which basically means replacement, augmentation, control, and this 4th concept that is by Egvi and Nardi of heteromation. Okay? So I'll briefly refer to each one of them, and then we can wrap up. So automation is the replacement of a part of the labor process by a machine. Okay? Very obvious. So if you think of automated transcription, which is sort of necessary for this automated translation here. What we replace is the human translator, who used to be in that cabin yesterday, and now it's done just by a machine. So a part of human labor is replaced. Okay. In general, when we look at the history of industrial capitalism, what is replaced is not the entire process at once. So you don't just take, Jans van Meyer's work and you just replace all of it at once. Okay? What you replace, the history of automation is the history of the replacement of little fragments of the process that are then integrated in a machine, for example. Okay, so that's very important because you don't have automation if you don't have fragmentation. And because of that, some authors still speak of what is called human extended automation. So you have a machine that automates most of the process, but there's one task that you can still not solve technically. So you put a human there. That concept comes from the context of sort of Amazon warehouses, where machines do most of the jobs, but automating the picking up of the boxes from the shelves would be too expensive. So it's just cheaper to have humans in those links. So this is automation. And when we think of AI as automation, then of course conflict immediately arises, because the conflict between sort of labor, people who work, doing creative tasks, and then that labor process can be replaced. That of course leads to tension and conflict. But then we have a second way in which machines and humans can relate, and that's augmentation. So this is when a machine or a tool augments or intensifies the workflow or the labor process. And this process can be both quantitative or qualitative. Okay? So you can intensify the speed at which you do something. So in the case of Chaplin's films, the aim of the machine was to intensify and to speed up the production process, to make it more efficient, faster, larger, etc. But there can also be qualitative augmentation, okay, which is the most interesting one, because it leads to, the human-machine relation leads to new processes, new ideas, new perspectives, okay? So then it's no longer about efficiency, but it's more about experimentation. And this concept comes from the origin of the whole field of human-computer interaction. Ligley there in the 60s, he thought about this notion of human-computer symbiosis. Okay? And he said, machines are very good at certain things, humans are very good at certain things and very bad at other things. Machines are very good at certain things and very bad at other things. So what we need to find is the perfect equilibrium between those two. And that's what he calls computer symbiosis. Okay, so some examples, Photoshop's generative fill would be an example of a quantitative augmentation, because here you could say a skilled designer, a Photoshop expert could also do this, but it would just probably take longer than just typing there. Okay. But then you have, for example, literature, AI literature, like this book was published, I think, 5 years ago already, which is an experiment that's co-written between the human author and ChatGPT, okay, or a language model. So this would be an example not of efficiency, but more of experimentation. Third, we have control. It's very important to remember this, I think, from a political perspective. Machines and AI is mainly used as a tool to automate management, not only creativity. Okay, and this also to manage creative work. Okay, so this is very, of course, this is most evident in platform labor, but it's also very problematic when it comes to creatives. Okay, when you're not just the user of the tool, but the tool is also surveilling your labor. Okay, but this is. I'll skip this and I'll go to the last one just to start wrapping up. And this is a very interesting concept by Egbia and Nardi that published already in 2017 a book called Heteromation. So they were not thinking of AI, they were thinking more of social media, but it's very interesting to think of the context of AI using the same concept. what they define heteromation as a sort of reverse instrumentalism. So instrumentalism is when you think that we use the machine to do something. So Marx would say labor is when humans transform nature to satisfy a need, and they use machines to do that, or tools. But reverse instrumentalism is when the machine uses the human to achieve a goal. Okay? So this is the most classic example. You think you're clicking there to access a website when you're doing your training, Google's self-driving cars, okay, which are now being burned in LA. And it's like a symbol of the protest is to burn the Google's self-driving taxis in LA. And here, your labor is, you're not using the machine to satisfy your needs. The machine is using the human to satisfy its needs, its training needs. Okay? So this is very important, because when we think of things like this button here, or when you want to make a space kitten and you choose which one of the two is better, you are serving the machine. Okay, and I think the table, the matrix that was shown in the previous presentation is great, because it shows which models actually use this data for their own training processes. So it's also very important to separate, okay, when are we talking about automation, when are we talking about augmentation, when are we talking about control, and when are we talking about heteromation, so when are we talking about we sort of serving the tools. So, just to wrap up, we have 3 or maybe 4 workflows, ages, and then at least 4 concepts to think of these processes. And do I have a minute? Yeah? Okay. So I said I was not going to answer this, but I've been playing around with trying to think, how would a cybernetic workflow look like? This is just like work in progress. This is really just trying this out. So we can discuss it. But this is how I see it, combining both tables, okay? So what I see, what's happening, what we're moving towards, is a sort of, I'm actually thinking that the output should be here, but that's why I have this just-in-time production. So there's an output in mind, and that triggers a particular input that then triggers a human operator, which we can call the prompter. And the prompter relates to generative AI through prompts, okay? And that is then there's an automated process here that's a black box. We don't know what's happening. And the output is it's augmented, okay? It can be qualitatively or quantitatively augmented. Listening to your presentation yesterday and today, I think what needs to be added here is that this is an iterative process. So that would be something I'm already need to change. But then there's a control loop here, because then the human operator can then, that's sort of the iterative process, because the human operator can then change the prompt based on the output. So there's a feedback loop in here. But there's also a feedback loop here where, you know, if you work for someone else, your boss can then use that information to manage you better. But also your input, your prompts are this is reinforcement learning by human feedback, is also intensifying or making this automation process even bigger. But also your output is being used for evaluation and training data. Okay. So this is more or less what I'm working on. Maybe I would add this iterative process. And this output, I would put it first at the beginning, which is a characteristic of post-industrial. So this is a combination of the 3 stages. It has some components of artisanal work, some components of industrial, and some components of post-industrial labor, all sort of organized around the idea of generative AI. So some conclusions. Why I think all of this is important, because we can understand, I think we need to understand generative AI as part of a longer historical process. Not everything that is happening now is completely new, as Silicon Valley likes to say. So it's a continuous process of continuity and discontinuity. It can also allow us to avoid sort of reductionist discourses, sort of, oh, this is going to change everything, this is going to make everyone unemployed, or this is just going to make everyone more efficient, etc. We need a more precise vocabulary, so our analysis can be more granular. And then finally, and this is something I find very important, is to, but I don't think that happens here so much, and especially I think this is the main bet or contribution of Frederick and Alex of thinking of the idea of workflow, is to stop thinking about the idea of the product and more about the process. And I think there's a tendency of generative AI to just think about the product, like Suno. It's like you don't need to spend 20, 40 years studying music. You can just forget about the process. You can get your song right away. Okay, so I think thinking about workflows is a way of challenging, contesting that tendency. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Sí, yeah. We have time for one super fast question. So yeah, Frederick.
Thank you. Probably we have time for more because being me, it's like, okay, I was the first, but I'd like the others to ask questions too. Thank you for the wonderful presentation, very helpful, and it's helping us to understand what we're doing. Yeah, and Claudio does it perfectly. And well, it's great to have you here again. I wanted to talk about this idea of the cybernetic workflow that you said. Maybe it's an algorithmic workflow, maybe it's related, you didn't use AI workflow. But I'll move to the question of heteromation, yeah? Because you use some examples that, in my opinion, are not fully explaining what heteromation is or may be, yeah? Mm-hmm. When we use ChatGPT and we prompt, this is heteromation. So, yeah, because we are training the model. We think that, as you said, that we are creating something, but we're feeding the model in a similar way that you showed with the Google example, yeah? So what you said is quite close to this digital slavery that Christian Fuchs has been talking about for decades, yeah? So my question is, when you are defining your own workflow, is there any way to escape heteromation? Is there any way to avoid feeding the machine? Because we don't want maybe to feed the machine anymore and just work as artisans, yeah? Again, as some authors say, that's my question, avoiding heteromation.
Thank you, Frederick. So yeah, I mean, the examples I gave were a bit rushed, but I would say completely agree that every time we use AI, we are sort of, I mean, there's a wonderful tweet by Benjamin Bratton, the author of The Stack, and he says, everything you're doing today is training future models of the past. And I think that applies for, so everything you do, even if you're not on, I don't use ChatGPT, I don't use AI, I don't have social media, but just carrying my phone around or using Google Maps, I'm training future models of the past. I think that's heteromation. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I conceptually, I didn't go into that here, but conceptually I think it's very important to distinguish, and I think that's what the concept of heteromation is useful for, distinguishing what is called data labor, so people who are, work as annotators, from heteromation, because those are people who are not working for the AI. Some authors like to think all is labor, but I think it's important to distinguish the two, but that's a completely different conversation. And finally, I don't think the problem necessarily is that we're feeding the machine. I think the problem is which machines and whose machines are we feeding. And I think that's the problem. And I think we're feeding the machines of those who we probably don't want to be feeding. So I think that would be my answer. I don't think so much is the problem of we all need to go back to working in our artisanal workshop, but it's maybe we need to feed someone else's machines. Yeah.
Yep.
I've got a comment on your question and your answer. Historically, I make my own AIs because I have total control over them and how they're used and how they work. Now, they're much simpler than what's available. So that's an option, which is something you can do with a friendly scientist. Or you can use things which are there's some ethically available music AIs, but the problem is they're not as good. Right? So you've got to make your choices about which dragon you're slaying or feeding, I guess. Thanks.
So yeah, we'll close this first two keynotes here. I think it's also really important to have this vocabulary in order to address the multiplicity of challenge AI pose. So we'll be having the coffee break now here at the hall, and we'll be coming back in 20 quick minutes. So enjoy the coffee break. Thank you.